feel free to. All right, Deuteronomy chapter 6. Let's take a look at verse 4. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. This was one of the most important scriptures to Israel back in the day. By back in the day, I mean 3,500 years ago, of course. All right. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. You shall love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. When it comes to approaching God, there are no restrictions. You're to go all out, not to hold back one little tiny bit, right? And everything that you do. And the way that Paul said this was, whatever you do, in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. It's Colossians 2, 17, I believe. So, from Deuteronomy to Paul, the message is the same. When it comes to how you approach God, you're to do it 110%, right? As every, basketball coach has said. With all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. In other words, every ounce of your being. Your heart having to do with your mind, your soul, your innermost being, and your might. Whatever you can put into it, whatever you can muster, that's what you're to put into your service for God. No halfway effort. No timid. There should timidness. Timid? What is that a word? How would you even say that? You shouldn't be timid. You shouldn't be hesitant. It's just full boldness. That's another word that the Bible uses. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 10, I'll just read this one to you. In Hebrews chapter 10, he says in verse 19, "Therefore, brethren, since we have confidence," or some versions say, since we have boldness to enter the holy place. When it comes to approaching God, we do so with all of our might. We're bold. We're confident. We have our head held high because this is the pathway that Jesus has paved for us. Whatever we do, in word or deed, we're to give 110%. We're to put all of our might into it. The problem is, when you put all of your might into following Jesus, that might look a little bit different than someone else putting all their might into following Jesus. The reason being, we all have different talents, right? What I can do to show my thanks to God might be a little bit different from what you can do to show your thankfulness to God. The way that I serve God in my own personal life may be a little bit different than what you do, what your role is, right? The Apostle Paul described the community of believers as a body. Some people are a hand, some people are an eye, some people are an ear, and every single part of the body is important. The eye isn't supposed to feel inferior because he can't hear, and the ear isn't supposed to feel inferior because it can't see. It takes all the parts and the diversity of parts working together to make up the whole. The point is, though, is that me worshiping God or following God with all of my heart, soul, and might look a little bit different from the way that you serve God with all your heart, soul, and might. And this is important to keep in mind so that we can remember a main thing, and that is, I'm not to judge you for how you serve God in your life, and you're not to judge me for how I serve God in my life. Meaning that your talents look different than my talents, and I shouldn't use myself as a standard to compare in determining whether or not you're right or wrong, and you shouldn't use yourself as a standard to determine whether or not I'm right or wrong, because who we use as a standard is not me or you, but is Christ. If an individual is lining up with Christ, that's what matters, not whether or not their talents match my talents. We see this in 1 Corinthians, especially in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, because you have individuals there that were judging each other because one person spoke in tongues, another person prophesied, another person served God in some other capacity, and there were those who had one of the gifts, and they were judging people that had the other gifts. So he says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 4, there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of ministries, and the same Lord. There are varieties of effects, but the same God, who works all things in all persons. The point being is that there's no reason for anyone to judge one another just because we have different talents. And we shouldn't lift ourselves up because the talent that we have appears to be more noble than the talent that somebody else has, right? We're all given certain capabilities, and we're to do those with all of our heart, soul, and might. It doesn't matter what those talents might be. We're to do those with our heart, soul, and might without judging others who might have varying talents from us, right? Let's take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 6. 2 Samuel chapter 6. David was a man who was very talented in his own right. He had a lot of things that he brought to the table in the Old Testament that weren't a big part of how people approach God until the time of David. So in some of the prophets, like in the book of Amos chapter 6, the Bible says there that David invented to himself musical instruments. In other words, he was introducing and incorporating instruments into the worship that Israel gave to God. And not everybody was a big fan of that. If you look at 2 Samuel chapter 6, they're bringing the ark to Jerusalem. Now, the ark is where God lived, right? It's what lived in the most holy place, in the tabernacle. And the Philistines, who were like the big bad guys of the day, they took the ark into their place, which, lots of bad things happened to them because of that. But now they're bringing the ark back to Jerusalem, and so everybody's rejoicing. And here's how David shows his thankfulness towards God that the ark is returning to Jerusalem. So let's look at verse 14. And David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. You just used that word a moment ago. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might. And was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. So you can imagine this scene. I mean, you can probably think of like a parade. They're coming back into town. They've got the ark. They're following it. And David and all the people of Israel are dancing with all their might. And they're singing and they're shouting. And there's a trumpet blast and all this. Now, if you read the first 11 verses, it wasn't an entirely happy occasion. But now they've kind of forgot about that. And now they're back to rejoicing. And they're dancing and they're singing and they're shouting and they're playing the trumpet. And you look at verse 16, and it happened as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David that Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So here's David and his friends. They're going down the road, they're dancing, they're shouting, they're playing a trumpet, they're offering up sacrifices, and here is David's wife, and she's looking out the window, and she's going, you got to be kidding me. This guy's a child or something, right? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought that about somebody in your life? You got to be kidding me. Somebody might look at me when I'm playing with Caden and probably think the same thing, because I'm just playing just as hard as he is, I'm jumping around on the playground and stuff, and they might think it's crazy. But that's how I show my relationship with my son. And that's how David was showing his relationship and his love for God. For David, loving God with all of his heart, soul, might, and strength meant dancing in the street, playing a trumpet, singing psalms, and writing music. Most of the psalms that we have, the songs in the Bible, are composed by David. David's used his harp to calm down King Saul, right? That was David's talent. That's the talent that God gave him, and he used that to the best of his ability, with all of his heart, soul, and all of his might. But unfortunately here, Saul's daughter who might have been a little bit bitter because of what happened between David and Saul, leading up to David being made king. She's looking out and she is despising him in her heart. And this same thing can happen to us if we're not careful. We can look at someone else's talents, like at the church at Corinth, and become jealous or envious, or even think that our talents are superior to their talents, and fall into the same trap that she did in 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 16. This same kind of jealousy or infighting or contention over whose worship was best was going on in Jesus' day as well. Let's go to John chapter 4. In John chapter 4, Jesus is meeting with a woman at the well. And we're going to look here at verse, let's see, we'll just skip down a little bit to verse 21, or rather verse 19. I've given this example before, but it is a lot of fun, and so I just want to give it to you again. Have you ever had a Bible question or something like that you're like sure that you're going to ask Paul, like whenever you get to heaven? Like you read something in the Bible, and you're like, man, I can't wait to get to heaven because I'm going to ask Paul about that verse right there. What were you meaning there, right, Paul? Or you might think, I wish Jesus was here to just answer this question for me because it's bugging me to death, right? Well, this woman at the well had a question like that, right? So here she's gone her whole life, and she meets Jesus, and here's what she says in verse 19 and 20. Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. So here she's had this question her whole life. Are we worshiping in the right place, or are they worshiping the right place in Jerusalem, right? Who's worshiping better is her question. That's her question that she's had her entire life. Isn't that kind of interesting? Like, that's the first thing you ask when you meet a prophet? Not like, how was the earth created? What did that look like? Or how did Noah get mosquitoes onto the ark? Maybe that kind of question. That's Vern's big question. That's the question he asked every single week when I'd ask, anybody have Bible questions? Yeah, how'd they get mosquitoes onto the ark? We smacked him like a mosquito. But this is her question. Her question that she's had her whole life is, who's right? Is it us worshiping in this mountain, or is it y'all worshiping over there? Or he said you people, which I don't think you're supposed to say that. But that's what she said. And then he went on to say this. He said, woman, believe me. Well, she said you people, and he called her woman, so I guess they're even. He said, woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. In other words, there's coming a day when questions like this aren't even going to matter anymore. It's just going to be silly. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Saying in spirit and in truth is basically another way of saying loving God with all your heart, soul, and might. Putting everything into it. Approaching God through the Holy Spirit, through Jesus, who is the truth. So what Jesus is saying is in John chapter 4 is, right now you have these questions about where do we worship? Is it your way or is it our way? Is it on this mountain or is it at that mountain? Jesus says, no. When the kingdom is established, is another way of saying an hour is coming. That's what he had in mind. That question doesn't matter. It's not about this mountain or that mountain. It's everywhere. It's in any place, right? It doesn't matter about where. It matters with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, in spirit and in truth, right? Right, exactly. Doesn't matter where, it matters how. That's another good way of saying it. And so you have these situations in the Bible. 2 Samuel chapter 6, John chapter 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, where people are upset about how other people worship. 2 Samuel 6, it was David's first wife who was the daughter of Saul. John chapter 4, where is it? Is it this mountain or is it that mountain? 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, well, I speak in tongues, but you just prophesy, so you're not that great, right? And all these fighting going on. But what it comes back to over and over and over again is love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. If you're doing that, or might, if you're doing that, then you're doing okay. Let's look at Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14. Look at verse 1. He says, "Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions." One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. He's talking about like the clean, unclean laws in the Old Testament. They had some things they could eat, some things they couldn't eat. He says, basically now we can eat anything, right? But there's some people who can only eat some things. Now, notice what he says in verse 3. "The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat. And the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him." Now, some people say, well, this passage is just talking about, Old Testament things. It's not really that relevant for today because we're not really following that kind of stuff anymore. But look what he says down here in verse 5 and 6. He says, "One person regards one day above another. Another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind." Now, I thought that said fully convinced according to my mind, but it says in his own mind. Now, you see the difference there. If it's fully convinced according to my mind, it means you got to conform to what I believe. But it says fully convinced in his own mind, which means that each individual has their own unique way in which they approach God, their own talents, their own opinions, their own thoughts. He says, "He who observes the day observes it for the Lord." That's worship. This isn't just some casual observance. This is talking about worship. "He who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat and give thanks to God." You mean that one person can observe a special day, another person cannot observe the special day, and in doing so, both are approaching God and both are accepted? That's what he says. He says one person feels like they can eat any kind of food, one person feels like they can't eat any kind of food, but both of those people are equally accepted before God. That's what he says. "For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's." His point here is, when you're a Christian, your entire life is worship towards God. Your entire life is a sacrifice. And depending on what you're fully convinced by, as you see there in verse 5, dictates the type of worship that you offer, the talents that you have, the gifts that you've been given, the way that you serve God with all your heart, soul, and might. And my abilities, my talents might look different than yours. And that's not to give us an opportunity to judge one another, but to lift one another up and encourage one another despite what individual talents we might have. Not sitting up in the window going, "I can't believe what he's doing over there," and not sitting around all day, "Well, whose mountain is better, my mountain or their mountain?" Right? But lifting each other up and encouraging one another regardless of what talents we might have. And here's what he says in verse 10. "But you, why do you judge your brother? Or you again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? For we all will stand before the judgment seat of God." He goes on to say in verse 13, "Therefore let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way." In other words, instead of judging each other based on whose talents you have, let's try this. Let's not get in the way of each other's talents. Let's lift each other up and encourage one another, despite what diversity of talents there might be among us. Somebody might prefer to lead a song or say a prayer or write a thank you card or whatever it is. Encourage each other in those things and don't pass judgment on each other despite what talents there might be. Paul goes on to talk about in verses 14 and following that he knows that there's nothing really that's unclean, but if somebody thinks it's unclean, then it is unclean. Somebody Somebody might not like a certain type of worship. Well, if they don't like that type of worship, to them it's unclean. So his point is in Romans chapter 14 is that we are to have our own convictions before God in verse 22. The faith which you have as your own conviction before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. See, the New Testament, or the New Covenant, is not like the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant, you have all these restrictions. That question, this mountain or that mountain, that does matter under the Old Covenant. And that's what Jesus said. You don't know what you worship because salvation's of the Jews, right? But there's coming a time when those kind of questions don't matter anymore. In the Old Covenant, there's all these lists of things, procedures they had to follow, things that they had to do in very specific order at very specific times. Those clean and unclean things, that did matter then. The days that they had to regard, that did matter then. But now what he says is that we're to all have our own convictions before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. In other words, if the way that you approach God is okay with you, and it's not offending your neighbor or hurting your enemy, then that's okay. But if what you're doing is offending your neighbor, even if it's okay with you, then it's not okay, right? See, the new covenant is about having love for God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love for your neighbor in the same way with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. If you're doing those two things, there's no possible way that you can go wrong. And again, loving God with all your might look a little bit different than the way somebody else loves God with all their might. One of the other things that Paul said in the book of Romans, just to bring this to your attention, is this: love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. If what you're doing is not doing any wrong to your neighbor, if what you're doing is showing all your love towards God with all your might, then you're not doing anything wrong. As long as what you're doing is okay with you, as long as it's not offending your conscience. Now you might feel like you can eat all foods, you might feel like you can't eat all foods. Regard all days to the Lord. Regard some days as special over other days. Whatever you choose doesn't matter as long as it's not offending your conscience, is what Paul's argument is that he's making. Love God with all your heart, soul, and might. And don't worry about those people sitting up in the window making snide comments and rude remarks about what you're doing. You just focus on you and your relationship with God and do the best that you can to lift others up so that they can feel free to do the same. And don't judge them based on your convictions. Judge them based on whether they follow that same principle of loving God with all their heart and loving their neighbor as themselves. If they're violating one of those, then you speak up and say something. But otherwise, I encourage them in what they're doing and lift them up just as you hope they would lift you up. So, that's the basic message, is to let's figure out how we best love God with all of our heart, soul, and might. And how we can best encourage others to do the same in their own unique way, in the way that God has designed them to perform. So we have that challenge before us this week. Find out ways that you can love God with all your heart, soul, and might, and show that same kind of love towards your neighbor, but also figure out ways that you can encourage your brothers and sisters in Christ in pursuing that same goal for themselves, figuring out what ways they can best show their love for God with all their heart, soul, and might. And if they end up dancing down Hickory Street playing a trumpet, then you better get out there and encourage them and not be mean to them. Yeah, that's right. All right, we'll go ahead and cut off the recording right there.